This video will cover subtopic 6.4, gas exchange. Here are a list of understandings, applications, and skills that will be covered in this video, and the required practical will be done in class. So before we begin this process of discussing this process of gas exchange, there's just a little bit information to recall before we start in on things. So just keep in mind that cellular respiration, and we'll go over this, is the controlled release of energy in the form of ATP from organic compounds such as glucose within the cells. So this is a continuous process in all cells, that generation of ATP. To support that aerobic cellular respiration, which does require oxygen, cells take in oxygen from their environment and give out carbon dioxide, that byproduct of cellular respiration. So gas exchange then is the exchange of gases between an organism and its surroundings, including the uptake of oxygen and the release of carbon dioxide. The exchange of gases between the individual cell and its environment will take place by diffusion, as shown by the picture here, where oxygen gas does need to move into the cell and will move to the mitochondria where it's needed for cellular respiration, and then the carbon dioxide that is generated by the breakdown of glucose is released from the cell by diffusion. Because it is diffusion that will mediate this exchange of gas, we'll go through those factors that affect diffusion. So surface area is one factor that will speed up diffusion, so a greater surface area allows for greater diffusion. So the structure of the lung will look to maximize the surface area through which gas exchange will occur. The difference in concentration will also affect diffusion, so the greater the concentration gradient, the greater the diffusion rate. So the lungs will look to maintain very steep concentration gradients for oxygen and CO2 to move them in and out of the lungs. And then the length of the diffusion path will also affect diffusion. So the shorter the diffusion path, the greater the rate of diffusion. And we will see that cells within the lungs are very flat and thin to help shorten that diffusion path, to help that efficiency of getting things in and out of the lungs. So with the respiratory system, this is a group of organs that work together to efficiently exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide between the organism and its environment. Now, there are several components to respiration. The first part is breathing or ventilation. And breathing or the ventilation can be broken up into two parts. There is the inhalation and the exhalation. The inhalation is taking in oxygen from the external environment, and the exhalation is the carbon dioxide. This is kind of the last part, I guess, of ventilation. So there's the inhalation, taking in that oxygen. Then there is, the external respiration will occur. And this is the exchange of gases between the alveoli and the blood. This is basically oxygen moving from lungs into the blood. So oxygen will diffuse into the organism at this part. And here, kind of going along with this is the CO2 diffusing out. But this is in the final stages of respiration. So to help with this process, the lung surface is large and moist, and we'll talk about how that structure is created to allow for this efficient gas exchange. Then there is the internal respiration. So once the oxygen is in the body, circulating in the blood, the internal respiration will allow for the exchange of gases between the blood in capillaries and the individual cells. So this is the oxygen now moving to the cells that need oxygen to perform cellular respiration. So you'll have oxygen gas diffusing into the cells, and here we have CO2 diffusing out of the cells. That CO2 will then now be exhaled. And that exhalation will again occur in the lungs. So just to differentiate between internal respiration and external respiration is what occurs in the lungs. This is moving air in and out of the body. And then the internal respiration is what takes place in the tissues, and this is moving oxygen and CO2 from the capillaries to the cells. So once that oxygen gas is now inside the cell, it can be used for the final part, which is cellular respiration. And this is where you have the breakdown of sugar molecules such as glucose into usable energy molecules such as ATP. This part will occur in the mitochondria and requires the presence of oxygen gas. And as a result of the breakdown of those sugar molecules, it will produce carbon dioxide, which needs to be expelled. So in terms of getting air that oxygen into the body, there are a number of structures in the respiratory system that will do this. So respiratory system starts with the nasal and oral cavities. This is where air will start the process of moving into the body. So you have air entering through the nose, and that air that enters through the nose is going to be warmed, moistened, and filtered. So warm air is used more efficiently, and the moist air helps prevent the lungs from drying out. And then there's mucus within the nose that will trap small particles, and there are nose hairs that will help filter out the large particles as well. There's cilia found within these nasal passages, and that cilia will sweep mucus and trap particles to the opening of the nose or down the esophagus. And then air entering through the oral cavity misses some of these important steps. So air coming into the oral cavity is not ideal, but at least it allows you to continue to be able to breathe. So next is the pharynx, and it's the area at the back of the mouth that acts as a common path for both food and air. Here, the pharynx will branch into two pipes. There is the esophagus, which will lead to the stomach and the digestive system, and the trachea, which will lead to the lungs. So there is that flap-like structure, the epiglottis, that covers the opening of the trachea when eating. So when you swallow food, that food will go down your esophagus and not your trachea. So what happens when things go down the wrong tube? So if you get air in the esophagus, this escapes as a burp. And then what happens if food goes into the trachea? This results in coughing that will emit that food matter, or choking as a result. So next up is the larynx, which is known as the voice box. It has several pieces of cartilage in it that will allow sound to be produced. So sounds are produced by vibrations of the vocal cords and vibrations of the air as it passes through the larynx and out of the mouth. So as air moves past the pharynx and the larynx, it then enters into the trachea. The trachea is basically the tube connecting the pharynx to the lungs, and it's surrounded by a ring of cartilage for support. Basically, that ring of cartilage will keep the trachea open. Now, the trachea is also lined with mucus to trap particles and moisten air, and then the trachea also has cilia along the length of it to help sweep mucus and trap particles up and out of the trachea. Now, as the trachea moves down, it will branch into two pipes, or the bronchi, or the bronchus for the singular. So the left bronchus will lead to the left lung, the right bronchus will lead to the right lung. Once past the bronchi, you get to the bronchi and bronchioles. So the bronchi will branch into smaller and smaller tubes called the bronchioles. The bronchi are the bronchi and the larger of the bronchioles are lined with cilia and mucus for filtering out that air, or for helping to filter that air. So as that air moves through the trachea into the bronchi, it'll enter into these bronchioles, which are smaller and smaller tubes. At the end of the bronchioles are the alveoli. So the smallest bronchioles in a cluster of tiny hollow air sacs, which are called the alveoli. So if This is our bronchi here. At the end of the bronchi are these little clusters of sacs that basically look like a cluster of grapes. And these are the alveoli. And this is where gas exchange takes place. So the human lung contains approximately 300 million alveoli. Each alveolus, which is a group of alveoli, is surrounded by a network of capillaries. And the walls of the alveoli and capillaries are each only one cell thick. So remember, capillaries are only one cell thick. The alveoli themselves are going to be one cell thick. And the thickness of these cells and the fact that it's so thin will allow efficient exchange of oxygen, or will allow oxygen to move from the space in the alveoli into that capillary network just below it. So the large surface area of the alveoli is due to the combined spherical shape of all those alveoli. So they have a round shape to them, and about those 600 million alveoli have a surface area of about 80 meters squared. The alveoli are basically flattened epithelial cells that are closely associated with the capillaries. So if this is our alveoli here, these little guys here with the black circle, these are flattened epithelial cells, and here we have our flattened epithelial cells next to that capillary that is just one cell thick. So it allows for a short diffusion distance from the alveoli to the blood. And underneath that alveoli is going to be that dense capillary network. And the alveoli are basically going to be lined with a surfactant, which keeps the lining moist for easy diffusion of gases out of the alveoli. So a ventilation system is important because it is needed to maintain concentration gradients in the alveoli. So the steep concentration gradients across the respiratory surface is maintained in two ways. There is the blood flow on one side and the airflow on the other side. So if we have our alveoli here and we look at air coming in, a steep concentration gradient is maintained in that we keep O2 levels high in the alveoli, and in the blood vessels they are relatively low. So that means oxygen gas will want to diffuse from high concentrations to low concentrations. So we will naturally want to go from the alveolar space into the red blood cells waiting in the capillaries beneath it. And this will allow these red blood cells to become oxygenated. Now the red blood cells moving close to coming into the lungs and coming in close contact or coming by those alveoli are going to be low in oxygen and high in CO2. So the lungs will also maintain a CO2 gradient by moving carbon dioxide gas out. So in this way, the CO2 concentration gradient remains low in the lungs, while it is high in the red blood cells coming into the lungs. So this will allow CO2 to move from a high concentration gradient to a low concentration gradient, and then when you exhale, that allows the CO2 to be taken out of the body. As those red blood cells then move through the capillary, this will then allow oxygen gas, which is in a high concentration gradient in the alveoli, to move from a high concentration gradient to a low concentration gradient in those red blood cells, allowing them to become oxygenated as they move out of the lungs. So this diagram just kind of gives an overview of all of the components of the respiratory system involved and all the different structures that we have talked about so far. So in that process of inspiration and expiration, so moving air into the lungs and moving air out of the lungs, this is done through a few structures using the muscles lining the rib cage as well as the diaphragm. So during that process of inspiration, there are the external intercostal muscles that will contract. The internal intercostal muscles will relax. The diaphragm will also contract. So this will allow the ribs to move upwards and outwards, and the diaphragm to move down. And what that does is that will create volume, or increase the volume of the lungs, creating negative pressure in it, drawing air into the lungs. To get air out during that process of expiration, the external intercostal muscles will relax, the internal intercostal muscles will contract, the diaphragm muscles will relax. So this means the ribs will move downward, so the ribs will move downward, and the diaphragm will move up, decreasing the volume of the lungs, increasing the pressure inside the lungs, and that increased pressure then forces the air out of the lungs. Inside the alveoli, there are different types of cells found, so different types of what are called pneumonocytes. There's type 1 and type 2 pneumonocytes. So the wall of each alveolus consists of those epithelial cells, as mentioned before, so these epithelial cells. Most of the epithelium cells are type 1 pneumonocytes, so they are the ones that will line the alveoli. And type 1 cells are flattened to a thickness of about 0.15 micrometers. The adjacent capillary walls are also thinned, allowing for efficient rate of gas exchange. So these type 1 pneumonocytes that make up the alveoli are very thin. They're flattened to allow oxygen to pass through easily into the capillary, and CO2 to pass from the capillary into the alveolar space. Now there is a second type of pneumonocyte found in the alveolar space called the type 2 pneumonocytes. These ones are rounded cells that occupy about 5% of the alveolar space. They take up a small percent of that space. They secrete fluids which will coat the inner surface that prevent the sides of the alveoli from adhering to each other, and by reducing surface tension as well. The fluid also allows oxygen to dissolve and then diffuse into the blood efficiently. And so now, given the importance of the lungs in terms of getting oxygen into the body and removing CO2, there are problems that can occur with the lungs, one of the most common being lung cancer. And the most common cause of lung cancer is smoking. It's responsible for 87% of the cases of lung cancer. Secondhand smoke causes about 3% of those cases. And just recall that smoking contains all kinds of mutagenic chemicals which can damage those type 1 pneumonocytes, and causing all kinds of other cells to migrate in there, reducing that nice thin area for gas to diffuse across. Air pollution causes about 5% of lung cancer cases. And then radon, there's a type of gas called radon gas, which leaks in some areas of the world. Ontario is known for having high levels of radon gas being emitted from the ground. Asbestos, silica, and other solids can cause cancer when inhaled from quarries, mines, and factories as well. Asbestos is a known cause of cancer and is still used for insulation and making other materials as well. It's very good at being fire resistant, but the fibers irritate the lungs quite a bit and can lead to the development of lung cancer quite easily. Silica is a component found in sand, so dust from sand can irritate the lungs as well, leading to the development of lung cancer. So the consequences of lung cancer include difficulties breathing, persistent coughing, coughing up blood, chest pain, loss of appetite, weight loss, and fatigue. Tumors can metastasize and form tumors elsewhere in the body. So oftentimes lung cancer, cancer that originates in the lung, can easily spread to elsewhere in the body. And so as that cancer spreads throughout the lungs, it can result in a loss of lung tissues, and the mortality rates are pretty high with lung cancer. Only about 15% of patients with lung cancer survive for more than 5 years. So quality of life, is not too good if you've been diagnosed with lung cancer. Another common ailment of the lungs is referred to as emphysema. Emphysema results from years of smoking, and emphysema is the gradual destruction of the alveoli. So the thin inner walls of the tiny alveoli can rupture due to all those harmful chemicals in smoking that create larger air sacs and thick walls, basically where you have these nice small sacs that have a large surface area. They can become damaged, creating these larger air sacs, larger, thicker air sacs where oxygen exchange is not as efficient. So that surface area for gas exchange is severely reduced, and the lungs become less elastic. And this damage to the alveoli is irreversible. So if you've been a smoker your whole life and now you have emphysema, if you stop smoking, you're not going to reverse that emphysema. So this is the end of the video for subtopic 6.4, gas exchange.